Welcome, friends, to the Regeneration Podcast. Good evening, I'm going to say, because tonight, recording in an evening. It's a Thursday. It's a Tuesday evening before Thanksgiving. And for those who are watching on YouTube, they might recognize my guest, our guest, David Cayley. And David, Michael Martin's, I think he's out doing something related to the farm, and he's going to join us in a few minutes. Let me tell you, David, that my first experience interviewing anybody about anything was when I wrote an article on about your book on Ivan Illich, and I reviewed your biography, and I put a lot of heart and soul into that, and I just knew that so much do I regard Ivan Illich that I just had to supplement it with something else. I had to,
Yeah.
and it was from no attempts to break into a world of podcasting. There was no part of me that just really wanted to do something online. It just felt like an act of necessity to talk with you so that the readers of Front Porch Republic could get even a fuller picture. And I can't thank you enough for that. I can't thank you enough for conversations we had in the interim. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm fine. I don't think you ever told me that. And
Yeah.
that was such a good interview. We had
My
such
tech the technology
we
was
had
pretty rocky
such a
on my part.
but we had such a good rapport.
We did.
Yeah. So I'm pleased to hear that was your first venture.
Yeah,
Um,
it was fun.
that's quite an honor.
Yeah. So tonight and I want you to bring up things that interest you, but I wrote to you a few weeks ago, and I recommended, and our regular listeners would know only by some name dropping, because I haven't gone into him, and tonight is not about the person of Christos Yannaras. But I sent to you like this name because um, throughout your writings, and we're going to mention your website and everything, you've been one of these people who, like maybe a Bill Kavanaugh and some others, have found it useful to question the whole notion, or maybe to recategorize in a more appropriate place, and sometimes I might even say like a smaller place, the notion of this thing called religion, you know? And I think, I'd been reading Bill Kavanaugh, and our listeners, we had him on the show, but we didn't talk about this. But on your blog years ago, you mentioned the name William Cantwell Smith, and you just had such clear language about like the idea of religion. Why don't you just kind of like entertain our listeners a little bit, because we're going to talk about this. We're going to take something of a deep dive. Tell people about your entrance point to questioning, what would you call it? The heuristic, the framing, the concept of religion.
Wow. Okay, well, first of all, thank you from the bottom of my heart for the introduction to Christos Yannaras. I don't know if
Oh,
that's
really?
how one should
I,
properly say his name. And when I looked him
yeah.
up, I discovered that he had died
Yeah, just recently.
in the summer, in
Yep.
August, I think.
Yep.
The
Some good
book
news for our
we're
Catholic
talking
listeners
about,
is, oh, go ahead. Yep.
the book we're talking about is called Against Religion. Mike recommended it to me. I found it tremendous,
Oh, good.
and in scores of ways, but
Wow.
very much relating to Ivan Illich,
Hmm.
uh, and seemingly no knowledge of one another whatsoever. He doesn't mention Illich. I don't remember Illich ever mentioning him. And yet, so much of what he calls religionization of the church is what Ivan calls corruption
Yeah.
of the church. Right? And so that's the first thing. I want to thank you for that. We can
Yeah.
go into Yannaras as you wish.
And you're
Otherwise,
going to love the whole corpus. It's wide. Yeah, like Illich. Go ahead. Yeah.
the framing of your question otherwise, about three different starting points um, suggested themselves to me as you asked that question. So I'll start off the top of my head.
Please.
With a sermon that I heard when I was probably about 9 years old. It was preached in the chapel of Trinity College School, where my father was a master. And the text was Paul's letter in which he advises, I think it's the Thessalonians, to pray ceaselessly, to pray unceasingly sometimes. Uh, so I was inspired by the sermon, and the next day I went by myself, quietly hoping to be unobserved, to the chapel when I thought no one would be there, to begin my career of praying unceasingly. And just as I was getting settled in a pew, the organ master came in to practice, and I was so mortified that I hid under the pew because
Really? Yep.
I was shy and I didn't want to be discovered. And
How
so
old were you, David?
I would say I was about 9.
Okay, younger than me.
And
Okay, yeah.
and so having committed myself to crawl under the pew, I couldn't really come out till he had finished. And needless to say, I did not pray
Yeah.
in the posture.
Yep.
So that's to say I was a devout youth who
Yeah.
aspired to be a Christian. And I can remember overhearing my father tell someone that, yes, we think he'll be a minister when he grows up.
Wow. Yep.
And yet I didn't become a minister, and I increasingly did not know how to understand the Christian church or to participate in it. So that's been a lifelong, to tell you another story,
Yeah.
a lifelong in and out, back and forth. But now I'm a young man, and I've joined a little congregation in Vancouver where I was living and working for the CBC. I came home one day after church, and my wife said, how come you're always in a worse mood when you come home from church than when you go?
I think that defines a lot of people. I think it defines a lot of
And
people.
I thought that was one of the most splendid questions I've ever been asked, because it was artless. I don't think she genuinely wanted to know. And so I had to
Artless.
try and answer. And I thought, well, it's because I argue with it the whole time, right? I argue with the creed. I ask, what does this mean? What is, right? So I guess you could say that I was trying to deal with a exhausted, for me, symbolic language, which still moved me deeply, which I understood and yet didn't understand. So I think my situation is not different than so many people's
Sure.
situation. I may have been more motivated to keep trying.
Very
So there's a
recognizable.
question of religion posed in my life. Now, you mentioned Cantwell Smith. That was a discovery much later that this object, religion, has history.
Which is different than most people think.
That
Yeah.
it isn't always the same thing. And so what Cantwell Smith said, and various other writers have said the same, was that the idea of a religion as we understand it really appears only in modern times, right? That as a bounded system of belief, segregated from living in some way or set apart from the ordinary business of living. So the emergence of a secular space, which is understood to be somehow different than the religious space, is a modern invention. So that for me was a solacing idea, because I began to see that I didn't really understand. I didn't understand this thing. So the position I probably came to, this is before reading Yannaras, is that religion is innate, as he says, right? He even uses the word instinctive. I don't know if instinctive goes a little too far, because if it appears with consciousness, then we would tend to contrast instinct with with the ideas we form once we become conscious. But leave that aside. He says it's innate.
But one little thing on that is because maybe it might be somewhat important, and I'll just use one example, and I'm not trying to say this is instinctive, but when I'm talking about this with people, David, I'm kind of saying religion is, in a healthy amount, it seems fun. Like when kids jump over the cracks on the sidewalk when they go to
Right.
the would you call that instinctive maybe? That some space is unlike other space, some time is unlike other time. I have an atheist um father-in-law, and yet he celebrates his quarter birthday, his half birthday, and his birthday. And I would say he's much more religious than I am, but he's an atheist. These are
Right.
different. Does that resonate
Yes.
with you?
Well, it's
Okay.
certainly, yes, because it certainly has that meaning, right? We would
Yeah.
say he's a bit religious about how he prepares his coffee.
Hmm.
And that remark would be understood by most
Yep.
people.
Yep.
That it's whatever takes a repeating form and then becomes somewhat hallowed by repetition, we
Yeah.
would call that religious.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I like Karl Barth's language where he says at one point that it's a yoke.
Mm.
It's a structure in which we're harnessed. But probably the idea that came to me while interviewing Charles Taylor is has stayed with me, which is that it's it's inherent in being conscious.
Okay.
One asks, one reaches for a dialogue. Where did this come from? What is this? How there must be another conscious interlocutor who is
Hmm.
not me and not you, not others like me. In other words,
Yeah.
that it is a dialogue with the source of the consciousness, the reason for being conscious. It seems to me somewhat inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so that yes, that says we're religious by definition, in the sense
Hmm.
that now that's quite different than the religion of coffee or the religion of not stepping on the crack, but
Right. Right.
it is another dimension of the word, is that we must, whether we're a theist or an atheist, whatever our conceptions, we must
Yeah. Yeah.
somehow be in conversation with the source of meaning.
Hmm.
Uh, we may doubt it, we may be angry with it, we may deny it, but the posture will be there just the same. It's structural.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's built in to who we
Hmm.
are. Yeah.
And do you think I think you've taken some deeper dives into Mircea Eliade over the years, maybe to come to terms with some of your guests at your, let's just name it. David Cayley again, ladies and gentlemen, produced the best body of work of anybody in any media in the last 30 years at the CBC, his ideas program. And you're going to go to his website, davidcayley.com, and discover he already mentioned he's talked with Charles Taylor. He's done the best things on Simone Weil, of course, Ivan Illich, great stuff on Rene Girard. But if we talked, and there's more, but this notion, I think that for Eliade, because I don't know if it wasn't from him, who else I got it from. But when I was thinking about my father-in-law, some space is unlike other space, and some time is unlike other time. How far does that
Yes.
carry you? And does that sound like it came from Eliade?
Eliade is
Yeah,
certainly one of the best people you can read if you want to understand
yeah.
sacred and profane. I mean, I think
Hmm.
it's in Durkheim. I think it's the idea is there
Okay,
before
right.
him, but
Yeah.
he develops it very brilliantly, and I think it's true. And I mean, for me, the decisive influence was René Girard, that
Hmm.
in showing how the sacred is made, right?
Okay.
That it is.
Hmm.
I mean, now some people will use the word sacred as a synonym for religion or a synonym for the divine. but I think it's better to use it more precisely in the way Girard shows you that sacrifice makes the sacred, right? It's literally
Can you
something.
describe that little? We've never done, you might be shocked to know we've never done a whole episode on Girard. Could you sketch out, even
Well,
for our listeners on that? Because
I
this is
can
very
try.
important.
I
Yeah.
mean, René Girard, after an initial book, which came into English as Deceit, Desire, and the Novel, uh, claimed that in the novel, as he analyzed it, he was a literary critic initially, you see the primacy of what he called mimesis, imitation, for human beings, that our most fundamental desires, that we would even call them instincts sometimes, are copied from one another.
Mhm.
And the copying uh, puts us into various situations of rivalry and competition with one another. So he took a second step in a book called Violence and the Sacred, um, in which he supposed that if imitation is our nature and it's the reason we can, I mean, the miracle of a child learning to speak, whatever grammar may be innate,
Mhm.
whatever basic structures are given, still an inarticulate child within a year to two
Mhm.
years learns the English language.
Mhm.
Most,
Mhm.
how is it possible?
Right. Imitation, right?
Imitation. We
Yeah.
copy. Um, it's the same way, music, whatever it is.
Yeah.
So Girard then goes back and begins to try and imagine, using mythology as his guide, the earliest communities. And he imagines that they must have been constantly roiled by the competition that is created by imitation, and that they would again and again have hit on the same mechanism for restoring peace. And that mechanism would have been one against all. Identify the malefactor,
Mhm.
kill the malefactor,
Name him as a contagion or
peace,
something.
peace is restored, and then the malefactor is a benefactor. He's actually the source of the peace, he or she. So
Mhm.
the that for him, I mean, that's pretty brutally simplified,
Yeah. Yeah.
is the origin of sacrifice, the origin of religion, and the origin of culture.
Mhm.
Um, so a sacred is made. That's the key element,
Yeah.
right? It's
Uh-huh.
where whoever wants to set something aside to make it untouchable will say that it's sacred, and that's, you may not touch it. It's been taken out of use, it's been taken out of conversation. You may not address in any way
That's well said. Yeah.
what I proclaim as sacred. So that's an element of religion. It's
Hmm.
thought of as an element of religion, but I think it's a it's just a human it's just a human operation.
Yeah.
So
So where do you know, laying, and I'm not saying we've done this comprehensively because it would take it so long, and I think we're going to continue to build some of the building blocks because it's like I personally just wanted to talk to you. You've read Yannaros. Why? I think this is becoming an increasingly important question in our time. Is that something you concur with, David? Like the
I
what
think it's
is
the
rel
most important. I would say it's the
okay,
most important question.
riff on that for a little while.
Okay, well, what does Ivan Illich say? Let's start with him and then come to Yannaros, right?
Hmm.
Illich says that the misunderstanding of the gospel, the misprision, the corruption and perversion language he also uses, produces the modern world. That is, the modern world comes out of the institutionalization of the fundamental idea of the incarnation. That God is present with us is the idea of the incarnation, right? Now God can be known and loved in person, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can see God in you, you can see God in me. It's a fundamentally new beginning.
Right.
It's a moment in religious history when basically the whole polarity of religion is reversed.
Right.
Uh,
I like that way of phrasing it.
David Martin, who was a British theologian and an Anglican priest, a British sociologist of religion, a brilliant man who I liked very much. In a book called The Breaking of the Image, he compares it to a nuclear explosion.
Mm.
So religion undergoes a nuclear explosion. It's it blows up. It's
Yeah. Yeah.
distributed. It
Uh-huh. But it
so
reconsolidated and how, but we'll get to
yeah,
that. Yeah.
other people have different images, but fundamentally what happened now, Girard, to go to him, also says this is not a religious event. This is the undoing of the religious mechanism insofar as it was a sacrificial idea, right? This sacrifice has ended sacrifice, right? Which leads
Mm-hmm.
Girard
For
then
sure.
to
Yeah.
say that society has become naked, unprotected in a certain way because it has lost its quite effective and efficient religious mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
We turn
And
we
for some
turn
reason,
on
I
it.
almost want to do a little parenthetical here as our listeners are, I have these conversations with people, David, and it makes them very nervous, especially in an anxious culture where religious behavior is keeping a lot of people, even if it's an overlap with a condition known as obsessive compulsive disorder, people are kind of holding on to these types of behaviors now because the world is going kind of crazy. But I
Yes,
want to let people know, that where we're going in my own life, categories of religion has made things like the incarnation, just explode with a reality. That
yeah.
like that um, Christ becomes more the Alpha and the Omega to me, the more that I can keep religion in context, if that makes sense. And that was just kind of me, like maybe welcoming some people who are following us this far, wondering if we're just trying to take down the whole show. Um, but I just had that, little interjection, to and you might tie that in only if you resonate with that, on how it blew everything up, blew everything up.
Well, I mean, the continuation of the story then
Yeah.
is the institutionalization of Christianity. And here Yannaras comes in, right? He
Hmm.
believes that what he speaks of, this is, again is Yannaras, um,
Yeah.
Christos Yannaras,
Christos, Yannaros, yeah,
yeah,
Yannaras. Yeah.
whose book Against Religion Mike introduced me to. So he speaks of something that he calls the ecclesial event, right?
I love
Which
it.
is quite beautiful and like what Illich calls conspiratio. So the meeting around a table, the communion of those who have recognized that this event has occurred and who recognize that a new possibility exists. And it's essentially to pass beyond themselves into a community, into a body, as the church understood it
Which
itself.
literally every young person is hungry for in our time.
Yeah, but that
Yeah.
it is essentially a stepping outside oneself, right?
Mhm.
And so it's a relation, right? And he has a wonderful passage, almost a frightening passage, but uh,
I'm
where
loving
he's
this so much that you just
uh,
took to Yannaros so well.
okay. So the renunciation, he says, so the giving up of oneself as primary, the renunciation is experienced as a mind reeling void, as total
Wow.
despair. It nevertheless proves to be a presupposition if we are to free ourselves from our ego, our nature, and give ourselves up without any reservation to the relation of love,
Wow.
to
Mhm.
faith, to trust. So that seems to be the possibility that was present in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, and that was continued by those who experienced him, whether they experienced him as a resurrected Lord or they took the word of another, because faith, trust is hugely important in this story. That this is not so far a religion.
Mhm.
It's a relation.
And he makes the point that religion was still going on in the
It's a
temple. Yeah.
happening,
Yep.
yeah, an event.
Yeah. Yep.
But it's not a religion, but it becomes religionized. Now, if you accept Yannaras' story that religion is innate in us and instinctive in us, it must become religionized in the same way that Ivan recognizes that Christianity, well, he doesn't say must, is very likely
Mhm.
to become institutionalized, to become corrupted in that sense, to develop a class of priests and functionaries who control and administer the religion, who produce it on command, who are in charge of the theatrical performances that it seems to require.
Mhm.
So Yannaris is wonderfully radical, Mike, right?
Again,
Like
I'm loving this so
he's
much. Yeah. Yeah.
quite tart about the theater of the
Uh,
church,
uh-huh.
right? Which,
And yet he loves reminding
about
our listeners. Yeah. Yeah.
he might be solemn about that, the
Yeah.
beauty of the
Yeah.
ritual,
Yeah.
the glory of the vestments, the beauty of the song.
Mhm.
He's not unmindful of it, but
Mhm.
he never mistakes it for the actual event of being in community,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Of
Mhm.
passing outside oneself and of recognizing that the truth is not in me as some sort of interiority that I can plumb, right? That's
Mhm.
all I need to do, right? I have all these aids, tutelary aids that are given to me. I eat the communion wafer, which he at one point says can become a sacralized fetish object.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's if you suffered, as I related,
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
boy, take the boy hiding under the pew as an image
Uh-huh.
of an ambivalent relation,
Yeah.
uh, or the young man who comes home from church angrier than he went.
Mhm.
Um, to have, but yet who yearns towards this what seems to be unreachable past, right? I have a portrait of my great grandfather, who was rector of a church here in Toronto and a professor of theology at the university. He's reading a prayer book in this portrait. And I look at him and I think he was a troubled man also, but yet there's
Mm.
an image there of how one ought to be, of what
Mhm.
of the piety that I can't quite reach
Mhm.
ought to look like. So yeah, Yannaris is really interesting about this. Uh,
Yeah.
how hard he is on religionization, or how direct and blunt he is about it. But he's essentially saying, and what I mean, Illich recognizes that as soon as the church takes on administrative responsibilities and legal, the bishops become magistrates, which is in the time of Theodosius, I think, not long after Constantine. You already have the rudiments of an administrative church, but Ivan leaned most heavily on the period in the 12th century where he felt he really, the emergence of what's sometimes called the papal revolution, the emergence of papal monarchy and so on. But Yannaras sets a lot of these things back into earlier councils, into earlier times. And
the Franks have a huge role for him, right?
yeah, he's a little snooty about the Franks.
Yeah, yeah.
The Greek uh obviously Hellenism was the matrix for a proper understanding of Christianity, and then these primitives come on the scene, and a great deal of religionization for him is explained as the only way of mediating the gospel to these savages.
Yeah.
So, if your ancestry is Frankish or German, you may a little bit. He can be pretty harsh about that, but
Yeah.
he does give a very interesting account of Augustine.
Yeah, yeah.
Right.
Really?
That Augustine as the inventor of a kind of intellectualism, a kind of interiority, a kind of legalism, which are all the enemies of the ecclesial event, right? Which cannot be understood in legal metaphors, which is not available within, but without, amongst, between, and intellectuality, which is producing dogmatic statements and generally objectifying the ecclesial event, which it cannot be objectified because it's not an object. So the book is just a rich mine on this subject of objectivity, right?
I'm just tickled again. Yeah.
Which isn't just objectivity as far as understanding the church goes. I mean, in the media milieu in which I operated all my life, and I've just finished a book about the CBC, which is coming out in the spring, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which in difficult times like the present, when there seems to be when new media produce a chaotic information environment, which certainly is the case, my old colleagues are very much thrown back in I think a reactionary way on the discourses of, let's say, objectivity, right? We're going to be objective. These people are in the grips of misinformation, so we need to restore science, objectivity, get back to the tried and true. But what you're getting back to is exactly what we should be getting over, right?
Wow. Yep. I follow totally. I didn't see this going there, but yeah, 100%.
Which makes it very complicated. But Yannaras is dealing with in the church context, right? That the Eucharist as something that I consume for my benefit rather than a symbolic meal that I eat with others in order to experience my community. I wish I had a better word, with them. And I don't think I even experienced that until after I met Ivan, and we would take mass together in outdoor settings or in a room off the rectory or somewhere where I wasn't in church, trying to compose my face and
not in church. Interesting.
Not in church.
Yeah.
Right. Then it became real that we were eating this celebratory meal in memory of our Lord together became real for me.
Yeah.
And not just in memory of our Lord, but in fellowship, right? So, yeah, so that he has a lot of rich material on objectification, on
Yeah. Yeah.
objectivity, on the idea that this is a magic bread.
Hmm.
And if I don't get the magic from the bread, there's something wrong with me, right?
Yep.
There's something I don't have enough
Hmm.
faith, or I don't have enough, it wasn't the freeing part of that is to understand is to get out of religion and say, well, this is something that can happen between me and anyone anytime. It doesn't mean that
Hmm.
we don't want to, in a modest way, ritualize it, or in a remember it, or name it, but we should name it, especially at the moment, very, very cautiously, I think.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And
Because
our friend Michael's
premature
citing it.
naming just leads to premature, like the the greatest gift of our time is to live is the invitation to live in uncertainty,
Hmm.
I think.
Yeah, that's
So
a different way of framing it. And again, kind of unpacking it in some language that some of our listeners would hear and inviting your comments, David, a few things. One is, yeah, on Augustine. So we're going to a lot of people who love Augustine. We do too. But Yannaras to me does two things. One is he sees these tendencies, as you state so well, towards a kind of a legal, a transactional, you could also say, I think, view of some of it. And yet in Yannaros, it's what the Franks did with Augustine that's the bigger story, that they really, he's
yes.
going to say they juiced it. And something interesting I did a few weeks ago is I might have been online and I saw some people really kind of still flipping out about Pope Francis and the Pachamama thing from about a year and a half ago. After the synod in the Amazon, there was this kind of feminine, it was an indigenous feminine deity that was brought to the Vatican. And
Okay.
and I was reading Yannaros and I was thinking, welcome, Michael. Michael signing on. I
Where
was
is he?
re Here,
There
you'll
he is.
see him. Yeah.
All right.
I was reading Yannaros and and I saw some people online, and I forget the context, but they were kind of flipping out on probably 2 years later, Pope Francis for doing this. So it was, and I work for I run migrant ministry in my diocese and things like that, and so I'm pretty okay with some indigenous elements. Anyhow, AI is an interesting thing, so I just asked AI, so they don't like a tribal entity in the Amazon bringing um, their parts to a liturgy. But I was thinking of Yannaros and the Franks. So I said to AI, I said, what parts of the Roman Rite did the Franks bring to it? And AI spits back all those individualizing and all those individualizing prayers. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
That the Franks brought it, and I thought so. There's indigenous elements in the Roman Rite already. They happen to be Frankish. They happen to be those ones that Yannaras would say they armor the ego, right? And that's useful language, the armoring of the ego. Whereas, and I'm going to kind of jump a little bit, but some of our listeners have read the great Eastern Orthodox theologian John Zazoulis, and in the larger corpus of Yannaras, Zazoulis has a huge role because some of what we're talking about with the ego, the armoring of the ego, and the ecclesial event is that distinction Zazoulis and others make between the individual, who's kind of the armored ego, the individual who looks at the world and says, Mike's dressing this way, Michael's dressing this way, I'm going to dress this way and be different, versus personhood, which is when David Cayley steps into the future, creating it, and becomes who God wanted you to be since before you were born, stepping into your royal clothes. Personhood versus individualism lines up pretty well with the religionization, is all about the individual. It armors the ego in many cases. And I'm going to say not all these behaviors, the Pater Noster or making the sign of the cross or telling your beads, they can be good, but beyond beyond critical mass, or used in the wrong way, they can kind of work against the ecclesial event, against the development of personhood by through the religionization, by kind of hypertrophy, and that's all individual versus person. And that's, some of our listeners are listening different ways. Michael Martin, all right, do you feel like you're connected? Can you hear us?
I can hear you finally. I don't know what the hell is going
At
on.
first, I saw two of you signing on, and then there's two of your blocks and everything.
I don't
Um,
even know.
yeah, so David, we're talking about this guy. A little background is I had sent, you've heard me mention the name, Michael, a book by this Christos Yannaras, who
Mhm.
always felt like it was kind of the yin to Illich's yang to me. And I knew I had to talk to David Cayley about him. So I said you might try him out, but it was just casting a leaf upon the water. And David Cayley signed on, and we hadn't pre-gamed or talked. And he's saying, like, he really, 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 really likes this guy. And the thing, Michael, is this notion, and you're going to have your own access point to it, is for Yannaros, David was mentioning um, that Jesus instantiated this idea that, like, you and me exist in relationship, and the more that Michael Martin surpasses himself in relation, Yannaros will say you know, that's death defeating death. You die to the individual,
Right.
you die to the ego, you live in relationship, and that relationship is eternal. That's
Well,
eternal.
you're talking about the religionization of the religion.
Mhm.
You ever see the movie What About Bob?
Yeah, it's great.
You know, the
No,
scene when
no.
Bill Murray's teaching a kid how to dive, right?
He's got OCD and he's really scrupulous, David, which ties in. We're going to get there. This
And
type
Yeah,
of
the
behavior
thing
in an
is,
anxious world.
yeah,
so,
religious.
so
Okay.
here's
Yep, yep.
Bob kind of organically teaching a kid how to dive. And right as he's about to do it, the dad psychotherapist runs out of the house. I'll take it from here. And that's what religionization is. That's because those things you're going to talk about the rosary, but all those things, those were folk practices, veneration of Mary, the rosary, all this other stuff. But then the bishops come in and go, "I'll take it from here," right? And that's what happens is they kill the organic spirit, that institutionalization of it. It kills the kind of grassroots thing. I was just talking to a couple of friends who they had started this grassroots kind of Orthodox church with just prayers at first in Maine, and they get it going, and then they didn't have a priest; they just had visiting priests, and then all of a sudden they get a priest, and he just not, they start to organize, and they suck the joy right out of it. I
And I
don't know.
think we're going to nuance this too, because I know
That wasn't very nuanced, but that's how I
no, no,
roll.
no, 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 but no, but it's the and this isn't about, like, we're using kind of Yannaros and Illich, but it's like my relationship, and Michael's relationship, that the ordo can still be a good thing, and it's not an either or, and I don't hear you saying it's an either or, Michael. But last night I was watching a video on Ian McGilchrist. That's a name you're familiar with, David?
Yes, I read The Master and His
It's
Emissary.
it's a tremendous book, and
I
that,
haven't read, now he has a new 2-volume work, I
yeah,
think,
the
which I have
matter,
not read yet.
yeah, the something about matter, and but um, the prioritization. It seems to me, again, like, if Chesterton gets at this too, where I think in What's Wrong with the World, kind of sees the same thing we're talking about. And yet and I've quoted him in an article at Front Porch, where he says, and I wish I had the exact quote, because to bring up Chesterton's name and not use his words is a sin. But he said, everybody likes a little gold on their cape, right? But he knows the hypertrophy of that is a disease.
Yeah.
Like, we can celebrate birthdays. This day is more special than other days, or Sunday. And then there's a hypertrophy where all of a sudden the tail starts wagging the dog. And for McGilchrist, this could be something like where all of a sudden the priority of left brain thinking over right brain thinking, you know, has a whole train of effects in its wake. You
Mhm.
know, these types of things. David, what do you think about, what Michael and I are talking about, and, like, how do we have a lot of people who are going to church and they know some of that order is a pretty good thing. I've been looking at it lately through, like, McGilchrist. Um, and Michael, you make a good point, how the church can come in and kind of take something that was good, But how do we? Because we're not saying that Christos Yannaras loved nothing more than the divine liturgy. He loved stuff. He couldn't be more grateful that there were these roadside churches in Greece that had icons you could pray in front of and things like
Yeah,
that, right?
yeah. Well, I mean, I've, as I began with that story for you, I've had to live my own situation. I've had to live into my own
Yeah.
situation without feeling that it's everybody's situation or that everyone's on the same time or the same schedule, right? But I do think that that it is broadly true that symbolic languages age, tire, break down,
Ossify.
ossify, and need to be renewed. And that, broadly speaking, we're in that period of renewal.
Oh.
I mean, two of the people I've been reading in the last couple of years since you and I got to know each other are Franz Rosenzweig
Yeah.
and Eugene Rosenstock Hussey.
Mhm.
And Rosenstock Hussey particularly has been a huge inspiration to me. But I mean, they were attracted to this idea of three ages of the church, right? Peter, Paul, John.
That's the way my brain works.
And I mean, for Rosenzweig, for example, the Johannine age, he'll go so far as to call Goethe the pagan is the first Christian, he says.
Yeah.
That's quite a statement. And yet
I agree.
I knew Michael wasn't going to object.
You see what he means,
Yeah,
right?
I do. I do.
Well, what Goethe said.
Hmm?
Goethe said, "I have a Christianity, but it's for my own private use."
Yeah, yeah. Well, Rosenzweig was onto him.
Yeah.
But I mean, another point that is made about this, the Johannine period is its diffuseness, its necessary diffuseness. Like it can't be an organized church because its destiny is exactly this distribution of the gospel. So if we go back to Illich says that, I mean, I'm going to take a chance here and simplify, but the injunction to preach to all nations, which concludes some of the Gospels, is accomplished in an underhanded way. It's accomplished through what Illich calls the mystery of evil, drawing on the use of that, or the mystery of lawlessness or iniquity. In the second letter to the Thessalonians, he takes the phrase, the mysterium iniquitatis, from the Vulgate, but he makes it mean the corruption of Christianity. He makes it mean the misunderstanding, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in that form, the gospel becomes universal in the sense that if modernity is a consequence, unthinkable without the incarnation. Now, that's quite a hypothesis, and not all will accept it, but I think it was Girard's hypothesis, Illich's hypothesis, numerous other people's hypothesis. Then we're encountering Christianity in so many different forms,
Mm-hmm.
and we're basically so the first thing is to recognize it, right? Is to recognize that the truth of our situation lies in what we perceive as the past, although it may also be the present.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see how you, when you're dealing with the problem of religion, how you can get around that, right? That it's necessary to recognize what's around you, and then also if possible, to unwind that or to wind it up, depending on how you use that metaphor, to try and understand what was the ecclesial event that lies behind Yannaras' language, the conspiratio in Illich's language, that lies behind this, right? That created this unusual, unprecedented dynamism, right? That was this. I quoted my friend, the British sociologist of religion, David Martin, Michael, who was also a priest, who says in a book called The Breaking of the Image that the crucifixion, the incarnation, is the nuclear explosion of religion. It's so, which is a nice image because you know, makes it easier to live in the mushroom cloud, and also to this image of dispersion, right? And of multiplicity is there. Yeah.
Multiplicity in unity. Go, Michael. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned Goethe. I mean, one place you see that kind of attempt at renewal and a kind of wild Christianity is with the Romantics, the German Romantics in particular, who like Novalis, and but all of the the Jena Romantics were trying to reimagine Christianity at their moment, and their patron saint and godfather was Goethe. But you see that that percolates through history, and it wasn't just them, but you can see that stream percolating even to today.
Yes.
There's the wildness. People hunger for a wild Christianity. Ecclesiology is okay, but just don't make a religion out of it. You know what I mean?
Well, that's quite a mouthful there. Ecclesiology is okay, but don't make a religion out of it.
I think it's well said. I love that.
I think you better unpack that a little.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's what
since
church.
How can you have
right?
a church? What's a church without religion?
Well, that's what Derrida wanted, right? What's the possibility of religion without religion?
Religion without religion, yeah.
Yeah. And what's religion without a church? Or
I think we need a church.
I think often, about like where I live and where you live, you got both of you live. When there were the circuit priests ministering to the native peoples, right?
Yes.
Maybe they might show up once a year, even with black elk. I have a picture of black elk showing a rosary to a little girl over my desk. And
that's nice.
There was such and not just them, but going back to the Middle Ages, the same thing. The church institution had so little power out there, out in the wilds, out amongst the peasantry. I mean, Christianity was a religion of the cities, right? So it was strong in the city. It had you can say the bishops had a lot more power in the cities.
Well said.
But out in the provinces, they didn't know who the bishop was, right? So things adapted and grew organically in those environments. Celtic Christianity is a great example of that. It was so far out of the reach of the administrative hand of the church that it was able to be Christian.
Yes. And that was an interesting starting point for Illich. Actually, it was. I mean, he and a friend had been interested even back in their student days in folk Christianities, but when he discovered the Puerto Ricans of New York and then went to Puerto Rico, he also discovered a very different. He discovered a wild Christianity, as you nicely called it. So
I discovered it in Mexican Christianity in my own diocese because I run the migrant ministry. And that's why I like kind of just to introduce this for the conversation too, is the notion of I'm a big fan. I don't know how it's going to play out, but I do see if we use that three-stage history, I like it. We talked about McGilchrist. He likes Hegel. I just had a bug on my screen. He likes Hegel for exactly that reason, right? And you see that symphonic, original harmony, discord, higher harmony. Um, we see that in symphonic music. We see that in the greatest plays, I think, in novels and so forth. Anyhow, like where I see the Holy Spirit working in this in the church, and it's probably fighting its way up, would be synodality, to be honest with you. I think Pope Francis intuits some of this, and he's desperately trying to kind of rewild. That's why I mentioned this Pachamama statue, the indigenous elements. And again, it goes beyond the church as she, to use Illich's language.
But I think that's
Yep,
still
go
an
ahead.
example
Go
of
ahead. Yep.
that's still an example of the bishop trying to take control, right?
I don't disagree.
I got it from here.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? I just don't know how you can do it in this day and age where the Pope issues a proclamation and within 15 minutes it's been read all over the earth, where it's just that kind of institutional reach is at odds with a wild or organic Christianity, and I think they're incompatible.
I don't think they're incompatible. The poetry, because we said, we could go from, if we're going to use this kind of three-stage heuristic, you could go from multiplicity to kind of unity to multiplicity again. But the real way to follow this is multiplicity in unity. And I'm not saying the Roman Catholic Church, but something, sacramental, I would say. But kicking it back to the peripheries, and yes, in a more humble way, kind of articulating that aspect that we all have in common, the one communion, the one church. So if Bonhoeffer said a religionless Christianity, that's a religionless religion. So boom, we set that aside a little bit, although we see the intuition he had. But I still like the role of church, because church is one and many at the same time. A friend of mine who was a mentor to me, pre-existed me in my job. He was a Spiritan, went to Duquesne, phenomenology, spent time in Cameroon, and this notion again, when we think of what Illich saw in the Puerto Rican Christianity, what I'm seeing in Mexican Christianity, the aspect that every South American country has their own manifestation. They all love Our Lady of Guadalupe in some way, but also they all have their own Marian image, and that there's this. I just see this plurality in unity, which can correspond with, or how would we start to describe this unity? It's the one bread, one body is something we might all
But
agree in. What do you say?
yeah,
Yep.
well, it's like the movie, The Mission, right?
Hmm.
So, I mean, the problem with the institutional church, especially with Francis in particular, I think,
Hmm.
is what Guido writes about in Empire and Church, right? There are too many political actors getting involved in that institution,
Right.
just like we've seen in the, American and Canadian governments, right?
Hmm.
Um, and it infiltrate that kind of network of evil just infiltrates everything. And it's I just, I think I don't see how I don't see how Christianity is going to survive that.
Yeah.
I really don't. I really don't.
The
Well,
church, the synod, like the synod working documents, they're saying kind of bold things. I've had to spend a lot of time with what came out of the synod, but it's really bold on East and the West. And again, I think the institution's going to protect itself. But we also see two things, that the institutional desire to protect itself and the fact that everything seems to be in turmoil now from the bottom up, things breaking from the bottom up and falling apart.
I agree.
well, I don't, I mean, I barely understand what's going on in the Roman Catholic Church.
Mm.
And, but I think the term church is indispensable, Mike. I agree with you
Yeah,
there.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think, to use my image of unwinding, everything that is commonly talked about, right? People will say in our society that they live in a mental construct called a society. They wouldn't live in such a thing if there hadn't been a church, right?
Mhm. Say a little bit more about that, please, David. unpack that a little bit.
Well, since I'm speaking to Americans, we the people, how can we the people make a state? Well, it's the ecclesial event down the road,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Hmm.
It's it's um it's an implication of what begins there. And um so I mean, whatever church turns out to be, we will continue to form churches, to
Well,
form
yeah,
Yeah.
churches.
Yeah. Yep.
And they will be, and those will be the communities in which we can experience
yeah,
this passing beyond ourselves and into others. And it's a way of understanding how we can be in and with and for others at any moment.
Mhm.
So yeah, but that's, I think, in your image of wildness,
yeah. And I think
that
it's interesting.
it doesn't necessarily look like a church.
No,
And that
and
was it.
you should try this. I mean, I have done this because, kind of my basic philosophical posture is what do you mean by that word? Right? Coming to terms. And
Yeah.
it's interesting. I've been on all these podcasts and things, and people say the church. And I say, okay, what do you mean by that word? The
Yep.
church. And that's one of those terms that falls apart upon the attempt to explain what you mean by it. So very often, I mean, when Protestants talk about the church, they have a very different idea from what Catholics, I
Yes.
think,
Yeah.
That's why I'm
and
saying some of these distinctions are super important. Yep.
yeah, and I think and even I don't want to go even farther, but I had a guy interviewed me because he saw me post something on Twitter about people don't know the difference between the soul and the spirit. Because they don't. You ask a theologian to define them, and they can't do it.
Mhm.
uh, uh, but it's those things, those kind of glittering generalities that we use all the time, but we don't really know what they mean. We think we know what they mean.
Right.
But I
Well,
like your idea, what you're talking about, which is where I think the church lives. It's like it's almost a Protestant notion of a temple not built with hands, where the parish that instantiation of what you could call the church, which I don't even think is the church, but um that's where whatever that is can, not that it does, but can come alive.
right. Well, I mean, Illich, who was my pole star and probably enabled me to think about these things, and probably in the sense that faith's primary meaning is trust,
Mm.
was the person I trusted, and probably couldn't have got to where I got without trusting him. Right. So he was my bridge, if you want. But he, from the early time, from meeting the Puerto Ricans and finding these different styles of Christianity, but also then in his missiology and later in his whole pursuit of the idea of a new church, as he called it, he always made a distinction, that there were always two churches. There was the church as he put it, right?
Mhm.
The the event, the ecclesial event that can happen, and then there's the sociological institution, right, which will behave according to sociological laws,
Mhm.
uh, and that we have to understand the difference. And he was pretty scrupulous about the difference. So when he went to Puerto Rico as the vice rector of the Catholic University in Ponce, he refused to behave as a priest because he said he was in a political role and that would cause confusion. But he bought a little hut way off in the far coast where he would sometimes go and serve mass to the fishermen there because they didn't know who he was and they didn't have anything to do with the university or all the political involvements of it. So you could call that know the difference. And I've never been able to get beyond the idea that that's the most important thing, to know the difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
To know what can be done in the world and what can't be done in the world, but can only be hoped for, prayed for, waited for, experienced in the world, but can never be reliably done, can never be objectified, can never be made a possession of ours, right? Because it's not in our power. And that's the fundamental difference for me, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
but we live in the world in which everything can be done because we institutionalized the gospel, we institutionalized the incarnation, we in effect said we could have it all, we could take it all, and we could put it into action.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what Charles Taylor says the reform master narrative was in a secular age. It's we can all become real Christians. We can realize this thing, right? And we're now, I mean, we're realizing it with a vengeance now. And it's realizing us. I mean, it's yeah. But I still think the thing to understand is the difference. If you want to stop it, you have to understand the difference.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key matter, and that the church. So we can't make churches, but churches can be made, and we can participate in that, right? Because we can experience the ecclesial event pretty much anytime, anywhere. But we can't take control of it.
No.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be the thing I would want to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know this book, Mike, right? You can't see it. The Catholic Thing.
She's great, Rosemary Houghton.
And that's she that's kind of her argument is that you have these two things. You have, she, the church,
Yeah.
but you also have Sophia, who she says she obliged them to think Sophia. It was certainly the influence of the unpredictable Sophia to which they were subjected. She obliged them to think some new and outrageous thoughts, and this is certainly her chapter. But again, it will be clear she does not work alone, right?
Yeah.
So you need the wildness to keep the institution from becoming petrified.
Right.
That's what Houghton's arguing, right?
And I'm loving the feminine that you brought up, the feminine, because this kind of gets me going in a wonderful way. Because if we're talking again, maybe about this three-stage movement, from the feminine to the masculine to something now in our time, which corresponds to the Johannine church, maybe, but the masculine and feminine combined is this Marian element for me, which is tied, only speaking for myself, tied to the local. As I mentioned, all these throughout these indigenous influenced expressions of Catholicism throughout all the Latin American countries. They all have their local Marian patroness. This whole continent, America, is dedicated to the Immaculate Conception, and this whole continent is dedicated to Our Lady of Guadalupe. The church that's dying in this time in America is a Western European Charlemagnean Frankish implant, right? That the American land is just kind of puffing up. And that hopefully what replaces it, and I just love that image of Sophia because, I've said it before on the podcast, some of this mystery about Marian apparitions taking place at solar noon for that particular location. Mary speaking in the patois of the language. At La Salette, she spoke to Maximum and Melanie in the local patois that was only in that one, and Illich would love this stuff,
Yeah.
where each valley was gendered. David's capturing the resonances here, and that type of church. Just so grateful you brought up Rosemary Houghton, because the tutelary spirit of this time is, my kids just watch. My son was over with his wife, and I met for the second time, my newest grandson, my only grandson, James Courage. But they were watching The Wizard of Oz last night. And I had used, in a series of 3 articles on the future of religion at Front Porch Republic, Dorothy on the American landmass in Frank Baum's words, which aren't antithetical to the movie, but she was just really this wonderful spirit, Dorothy, and we see this. She's a distinctly American creation, and I'm
Yeah.
just loving that, like, this landmass from the Arctic Circle to Tierra del Fuego. We might be coming into our own with the divine feminine and these local churches, local culture, local patois, things like that. David, what are you hearing?
Well, I'm hoping you guys are going to get over thinking of yourselves as the only Americans soon,
Thank you. Yeah.
because that's a huge, I
It's a
think,
problem.
stumbling block in American consciousness.
Wow, well said. Well said.
Is the counter-revolutionary Tories, from whom I'm descended, who fled the Republic in
What?
1783, were Americans, and they established another American country in Canada.